Good day, everyone. So today we will be discussing Unit 1, which is on origins of language. Now, this particular lesson will be in four parts, and today we will be discussing part 1, which is on the language evolution. So, before we begin the lesson, let's first have a brief overview of what language is supposed to be. If you could so kindly read this, it's a statement by George A. Miller in 1991. He said that language in general is important not only because it distinguishes human beings from all other animals on the earth, but because directly or indirectly, it makes possible the elaborate organization of civilized society. And language in general is interesting because although everyone knows and uses a specific language, few people understand what they know. Becoming self-consciously aware of what is known and self-consciously carries a special brand of excitement. So kung makikita nyo, dito pa lang sa isang particular statement na to ni George A. Miller, we would already have a brief idea of what language comprises. However, as we move along the lesson, we will understand that language is a complex topic that still has many facets to be discovered and many conceptualizations to be validated. We will also be finding out in this lesson that there are still questions left unanswered about language, and hopefully, through this particular course, we will be able to shed light or interest into some of these questions. All right? So, first, kailangan muna nating malaman, of course, how do we even define language? In particular, what is language? Now, I have to warn you ahead of time that the definition of language continuously changes. So, we cannot make a specific definition of language that transcends all aspects of time. Because, of course, as we know, language is also part of culture, and culture changes. And because of that, we develop new language. There are languages that become extinct, and there are languages that become endangered. All right, but in this particular lesson, what we are going to do is to look into many different definitions over the years that has been provided to language. So Bori in 2000 said that language is a system of symbols with several levels of organization, at least phonetics, syntax, and semantics. So meaning to say that language is comprised of three particular facets that includes sounds, grammar, and meaning. And this particular system of symbols is always present in all parts of languages or in all existing languages all over the world. All right. Meanwhile, Noam Chomsky in 1995 mentioned that language is both a cultural phenomenon and the most salient distinguishing characteristic of modern Homo sapiens as a species. And Chomsky anchors on this definition of language because this definition is very supportive of his nativist perspective of language, which we will be discussing in the second unit. Now, if you would notice, Chomsky's definition comprises a cultural aspect of language, meaning to say that language would certainly exist in a certain society and it allows us to distinguish ourselves from other species, such as the primates. Okay, so ibig sabihin lang nito, we consider ourselves as more evolved species than others in Chomsky's perspective because we are able to utilize a certain set of language that is evident and present in our own culture. Meanwhile, Crystal in 1999 mentioned that language is a system of conventional spoken, manual, or written symbols by means of which human beings as members of a social group and participants in its culture express themselves. So kung makikita nyo dito, ang definition of language is more on the social and interactionist side. Language is seen as a method by which people communicate and people are able to express themselves through a variety of methods, such as written symbols or verbal cues or spoken and manual methods. All right, and this particular definition would entail that language is used as a communication device, and it's evidenced in basic human communication. All right? Now, I want you to not limit your understanding of language in these three main definitions. However, what I want you to see is that language could also be interpreted in different ways. And this, again, is the reason why we don't have a global or generalized definition of language. Now, as we go along, I encourage you to utilize your learnings and the lessons that we will have in order for you to perhaps create your own definition of language. I hope that over the next few weeks and over the next few lessons, you will have this developed sense of what language is all about and how language enables us to proceed with our daily lives. And in that sense, we also want to express that there are many studies involving language. And the umbrella term for that would be linguistics. Okay, and linguistics is the branch of science that studies the origin, structure, and use of language. So when we say linguistics, we are not only interested in understanding how language developed, we are also interested in studying the different structures of language all over the world, including existing and non-existing languages and how language is being used. Now, kindly take note that when we say linguistics, we do not just study language in these three aspects as well. There are other subtopics involved in linguistics, such as the psychology of language, the archaeological evidences involving language, the social aspect of language, and these particular sub-perspectives allow us to entangle linguistics or the study of language with other scientific disciplines such as psychology, anthropology, archaeology, evolutionary psychology, biological psychology, even biology, and sometimes even chemistry. All right? And this particular notion would also tell us that linguistics and the study of language is very, very complex. And at the same time, kahit na marami na tayong discoveries about language, marami pa rin tayong mga bagay na hindi alam tungkol dito. And this is the reason why a lot of psycholinguists even, or researchers in the field of language would attempt to create various theories associated with how language evolved and developed. All right, and as we go along this particular lesson, you will discover that many ideas about how language developed were promoted by various theorists. Okay? All right. So before proceeding with lesson 1, let's first understand what makes a language a language. Ano nga ba ang ating criteria for saying that a particular set of words or phrases or a spoken activity is part of a certain language? Now, Santana in 2016 has proposed 3 primary criteria for understanding a certain language. All right? So these are the 3 criteria to say that a set of words is a language. Number one, please take note that X here would be the particular language, such as Filipino. Okay? So number one, X exists in a form accessible to scientific study. All right? So particularly, a language should exist or should have existed in a particular point in time. Now you may ask me, ma'am, how is it that this particular condition would satisfy languages that no longer exist, such as Latin? Now the answer would be through archaeological or anthropological evidences. The main point of criteria 1 is that this particular language should have existed in a particular point in time. And it doesn't matter whether or not this particular language is still existing today. What matters is that there are evidences to show that it has existed, and these evidences could be used in scientific study. Say, for instance, hieroglyphics. How is it that hieroglyphics is or was actually is considered an ancient language of the Egyptians? Kahit hindi na naman talaga siya ginagamit ngayon in Egypt. Well, it's because there are many anthropological and archaeological evidences to suggest that hieroglyphics was a widely used language in the ancient times. All right, and these evidences are what archaeologists would anchor on in understanding that hieroglyphics existed as a language. Clear? The second condition would be X is descriptively a primary object of study for linguists. Meaning to say, and to simply put it, it is a feasible area of study. It is a topic that it is within the scope of the study of linguists. Ibig sabihin lang nito, if we go back here, all right, if we go back to defining the definition or to defining linguistics, okay, we are talking about primarily the origin, structure, and use of language, primarily. Now, if a language, if a particular set of words or sounds are being used in society, for example, or it is of the interest of linguists to understand how this primary language developed or how this primary set of words or phrases developed, then definitely it could be realized as a language. So basically, number 2 is just saying that if it falls within the scope of the study of what linguistics should be studying, then it could qualify as a language. Thirdly, it has been reasonably referred to as a language, and it has been considered by society as a language. Now, what makes someone refer to a particular set of words as a language? Basically, when a certain group of people would use it. So number 3 would mean to say that if a certain group of people, whether that group of people is a small group or a large group, as long as it is used within the context of a group or through any form of social interaction or any particular activity in society, then that may qualify as a language. Now you might ask, ma'am, is it required that all these 3 criterion will be satisfied in order to understand that a language exists? The answer would be yes. Hindi pwedeng dalawa lang out of the two criteria are satisfied. In order for us to say that this particular set of words or this particular set or group of phrases is a language, then these 3 conditions should be satisfied. All right? Now, as I am talking about earlier, language is also a complex set of symbols. Now, there are many constructions of language, meaning to say, how is language being used? How exactly is language understood in society? Actually, Santana 2016 also proposed three particular uses or constructions of language. Number one, language is psychological. It's used to express emotions, feelings, even behaviors, thoughts, and this particular aspect of language allows us to represent ourselves in society. It allows us to express ourselves, to say that, oh, I don't want this, to say that I like you, I love you. It's it's an expression of how we want to communicate ourselves to others. Secondly, language is also social. We do not communicate within ourselves alone. Hindi naman pwedeng all the time sarili mo lang yung kausap mo, right? So, language primarily is used as a communicative device, as what Crystal in 1999 mentioned. Language is a communicative device that allows us to express and to interact with other people, whether that may be verbally, in written form, okay, in some sort of sign language. In whatever case, we want to interact with other people when we utilize a certain language. And these particular interactions allow us to develop more complex relationships with others, such as holding a job. How do you think of, um, how could you even hold a job without talking to others or speaking to others? Some of you may argue that why is it that PWD, such as deaf or blind people, are able to work? Well, they utilize a certain set of language as well. It may not be common to use sign language or even the Braille system, but that is still a language that allows them to communicate with others. So basically, language as a social construct enables us to socialize and continue socializing. And as you know, socialization is a very important aspect of any membership in a particular group or society. Next would be language as abstract, meaning to say that language could enable us to understand abstract concepts. Language enables us to provide context into concepts that we cannot really understand just by observing them. Even, for example, our thought processes. Think about this. You see a painting, you immediately think about the painting. You immediately think, what does this mean? What does this imply? How do I interpret this? What was the goal of the artist in making this painting or painting this particular work of art? Now, immediately those questions inside your brain is already something that allows you to utilize your language, your set of language. The way that you think about it is considered a psychological construction of language. But the means by which you interpret those thoughts and those abstract concepts would entail you to have a representation of abstract concepts through language. And for an easier example, let's say you feel guilty or you feel, what are other, kilig. Okay, kilig. Kilig is somewhat an abstract concept in the Filipino culture. Now, how do you express kilig? How do you even explain kilig? Okay? Or let's say you're telling us that mm, you feel overwhelmed, which is abstract, right? How do you say that you feel overwhelmed? How do you express that? The way you express that means that, or if you are able to express that in words or in certain phrases, then it would mean to say that language works for you in explaining or working on abstract concepts. These particular constructions of language allow us to function well in society, and it allows us to develop certain skill set that establishes communication, rapport, relationships with other people. All right. And with this particular background in mind, we proceed to understanding lesson one, which is on the origins of language acquisition. Now, basically, the leading questions that we will have in this particular lesson would be these four questions. Number one, ano-anong factors ba ang nag-contribute sa development and evolution of language? Number two, did language develop in a single leap or in stages? And number three, is language only limited to humans? Lastly, why is it that only human beings were able to develop a complex set of language? We will strive to answer these four questions as we go along, and hopefully you'd be able to utilize the learnings that you may have had in hopefully advancing the readings and applying them here in understanding further the lesson. All right. Before anything else, let's first distinguish what differentiates animal language from human language. Basically, there are three main distinctions. Number one, you should know that animal language is comprised of a few dozen distinct calls for specific purposes. Ibig sabihin, there are sounds made by animals in order to assess whether there is a threat, whether there is food available, whether there is danger or not. And these distinct calls are made by almost all animals. All right? Of course, for example, you hear a dog barking, you hear a cat meowing, or an owl howling. These activities, okay, are distinct calls that allow them to communicate with other animals. However, one thing that needs to be highlighted is that these are not symbolic. When we say these are not symbolic, a howl is just a howl. A howl, say for example, when they are being threatened or when animals are being threatened, is just their cry that they are being threatened. Or when they are hungry, a dog who is hungry will bark, maybe would bark or do any other sound. Then that particular sound is just because they are hungry. Ito ang pinagkaiba niya sa humans. Humans would utilize language as symbolic, like they attach certain words or phrases to a certain abstract psychological or social symbol, such that when we say hungry, okay, when we say hungry, we are able to distinguish that that particular word hungry is already a symbol of a physiological hunger you are feeling inside. Or when we say love, that particular word is a symbol of a certain feeling that we evoke to another human person. However, okay, among animals, this is not the case because they only have distinct calls which are almost too similar to each other, and these distinct calls just mean or just are just made when they are experiencing certain things. All right? And I want to clarify that the few dozen distinct calls that animals make may or may not be very, very similar in nature. Such as, for example, a bark for a dog may be meant to say that they are hungry or they are threatened or they are in danger. So we could have multiple meanings for a certain bark or a certain chirp among birds or a certain sound from any other animal. And this is also the reason why we say that animal language is not symbolic. And the third criteria is that animal language would utilize sounds more than words. You don't hear an animal say, "Wow, that looks delicious," except siguro for a parrot or an animal that could imitate the sounds. It could imitate the voice of humans, but for them as well, that looks delicious would not usually mean anything because they are just imitating the sounds and not actually comprehending these sounds. All right? So, do you ever hear a human say arf arf to symbolize that they are hungry? I don't think so, right? It's not usually the case. So, those things or these three things are what distinguishes animal language from human language. Actually, it doesn't really, I don't think it's really appropriate to call it language, but more on animal communication rather, to just have a more, kumbaga, appropriate term for that. All right. Understanding now how animal communication differs from human language, we now delve on understanding kung paano ba nagsimula ang human language as we know it today. So basically, the way that I am speaking right now is part of language, and we know that how I speak or even how you speak at the moment will not be the same if we compare it to millions or hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now, the main thing that baffles linguists and researchers in the field of language would be that there is no specific period when humans were recorded to develop language. This is the primary question. And according to many linguists, this is the problem. It's because, unlike other parts of culture, such as food, okay, such as architecture, art, they would have material evidences or plenty of material evidences to determine how a particular material culture developed. Ibig sabihin lang nito, in terms of language, the only mechanisms or methods that we will have to understand language would be the written languages that have survived over time. However, the development of written language could already be considered complex enough in understanding how language evolved, because what we are after here in this particular topic is when and how did language begin. And answering that question, sometimes you couldn't even fathom about thinking it. What could have happened millions of years ago that enabled humans, okay, and the species existing back then to develop these set of words or languages that allow us to speak in this particular present time. Now, basically, using the evolutionary perspective, human language was believed to have begun with grunts and cries, such as just sounds, ano pa bang mga cries, like cries of pain, maybe from getting hurt while hunting or being ravaged by some predators or being hurt by particular activities. Now, this is the most basic. However, as we go along the lesson, we will understand na hindi lang naman talaga ito ang reasons for language development. Now, linguists and researchers would ask, if this would be the case, and if language began with just grunts and cries, and we know that animals could also do the same to their distinct calls, then what made humans special that they are able to acquire this particular capacity to speak as we do right now, but other primates and other species could not even do this? Now, it has to do with the evolution of the physiological characteristics of humans and chimpanzees. We are using chimpanzees here because we know that primates are the nearest kamag-anak of the human species. And we see that these particular characteristics that are evident among humans, such as having opposable thumbs, development of lower extremities suited for walking upright, lack of body hair, weaker muscles, smaller teeth, and in particular larger brains, would help us distinguish ourselves from chimpanzees and other primates. And this particular evolutionary development led us perhaps to have a more complex set of skills enabling us to develop language. Linguists would say that larger brain size, okay, that the larger brain size or an improvement in the brain is not only a physical development, but more on a cognitive development. Because as our brains continue to develop physically, kung lumaki din yung brain and kung lumakas yung capacity ng brain, then it would follow that our cognitive or cognitive processes would also improve, such as in particular, remember the development of the frontal lobe would enable us to do executive functions, plan, make decisions, okay? Even develop language and speak multiple language. So that particular brain development would allow us to do that. Now, understanding that there is evolution, that there is a particular point in time kung saan nahati ang genetic line between chimpanzees and humans na nag-separate sila with chimpanzees going one way and humans going another way. The question is, again, what in particular triggered this line to utilize or to go into two paths? Okay, sige, understanding that there are physiological difference, but what triggered these physiological differences? That is a particular question na hindi pa rin masagot hanggang ngayon ng mga linguists, historians, and archaeologists because again, wala naman tayong enough or sufficient physiological evidences to prove what changes occurred during this time. Okay? Now, what evidences do we currently have to say that naghati ang genetic line between chimpanzees and humans that enable us to develop the language that we have now? Number one, according to the Linguistic Society of the United States, they discovered, or there was a discovery that the shape of the vocal tract that was discovered is an anatomical evidence from 100 years ago. Ibig sabihin, basically, since 100,000 years ago, basically, since 100,000 years ago, we could say that language began to develop differently kasi nga nagbago na yung shape of the vocal tract. And this is an evolutionary achievement. Now, the shape of the vocal tract becoming more developed, okay, allowed people to restrict the range of vowels and consonants, all right, to develop certain sounds that they weren't able to do before, and to even develop an earlier form of sign language. Not particularly sign language as we know it today, but a symbolic language that anchors on using specific and distinct sounds in order to create meanings out of certain things, such as maybe using to refer to a stone, or a louder grunt to another object, or things like that. Now, the question is, if anatomical evidence from 100,000 years ago has already been found, is it enough to say that language only began 100,000 years ago? Kumbaga, ito bang language development or the evolution of language, is it really something that started only 100,000 years ago? The answer is actually no. All right. The answer is no. Why? Because, all right, because as we know it, okay, because as we know it, all right, the early hominid species could have already had been using certain forms of communicative tools, not necessarily language, that allowed them to communicate appropriately with other people. Okay? And some critics of this particular discovery would say that the restricted range of consonants and vowels that people have discovered back then were proof as well that there was a previous stage by which these restricted words or consonants were initially learned. At the same time, some critics would also say that the evolution or the shape of vocal tract did not actually begin language or facilitate the beginning of language, but it just made language and speech a lot faster in spoken terms as compared to how it was before. Unfortunately, wala pa nga kasi tayong evidences regarding that. However, what I want you to understand is that evidences from 200,000 to 100,000 years ago would place the earth or the world in a period of discovery of cultural artifacts and evidences of civilization. Meaning to say, it was during this time, okay, that civilization would perhaps have begun or would perhaps have taken a big leap in terms of development. And many material artifacts or material cultural evidences, not just limited to language, were discovered during this particular time. And that says something about human development, that there is a particular event in history that led people to utilize more complex tools and to form certain groups that would make up the earliest civilizations. The second proof or evidence says that language actually evolved would be there are beliefs that a common language capability existed between humans and primates. Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina that what made the divide. There is a certain divide, di ba, na naghiwalay ang development of primates and naghiwalay ang development of humans in terms of language development. However, the question is, what are these distinct characteristics that made them similar? Number one, humans and primates are able to do vocal imitation. Kaya nilang gayahin yung boses, or not actually the boses, but rather the sounds made by certain humans. Primates could also do the same. And memorization with a certain limit could also be made by primates. They could memorize events, things, logics, sequence, and the like. And these two characteristics enable us to see that if primates and humans could both do the same thing, then why is it that it's only humans who developed a complex set of language? Again, we go back to that point in time na sinasabi nga ng mga linguists and archaeologists natin na naghiwalay ang development ng humans and primates. Now, recently, FOXP2 is a gene that was recently discovered, and it's shown to have inhibitory effects to language and facial control, particularly control in the mouth. All right. And this particular gene, all right, was also found, a similar version of this was found in primates. And according to evidences, humans also had this gene, but eventually, okay, it evolved 200,000 to 100,000 years ago. And we go back again to this particular time when 200,000 to 100,000 years ago was deemed as a period of discovery of cultural artifacts and evidences of civilization. So what we mean to say in this third particular bullet is that humans may have had FOXP2 genes, the early humans may have had that. However, unti-unting nag-evolve ito. And when this particular genetic material evolved, this allowed us to generate the capacity to develop the language that we have now. Again, another question is that what triggering factor led this particular gene to develop? That again is an unanswered question that is within the realm of the historical and evolutionary perspective of language. Okay. There are also a question on how language developed. Did it occur in stages or did it occur all at once? The interesting thing about it is that theorists would suggest that it occurred all at once, and others would suggest that it occurred in stages. Now, when we say it occurred all at once, a term for that would be monogenesis. So there is a monogenetic principle of language, meaning to say that language in a particular theorist's perspective would have evolved all at once. How? Theorists would suggest that there would have been a singular mutation in the brain. Kumbaga, the brain already had a different wiring suddenly, and then this particular differentiation in wiring allowed people to develop differently than other primates. And because of this different wiring in the brain, all right, different sounds were also created and complex meanings were associated with those sounds. Meanwhile, the polygenetic perspective or the perspective that language developed or occurred in stages would say that there are special properties or special developments within language that develop per particular stage through various hominid lines. Meaning to say, the language that we know today did not just occur in just one species, but in other species as long as they are within the hominid line. So the first step would have been, number one, there would have been a digitization of signals, meaning to say signals were made into symbols. There were certain and particular meanings that were already or made in relation to these particular sounds, such as when a particular signal is made, there is a certain meaning attached to that. That was the first development. Okay? That was the first stage. After that, the second stage would be to string the words and the signals and the symbols together in order to make more complex sentences. Now, it's notable to think that stringing of words together during that time was not similar to how we string words today. They, of course, did not use full sentences like we do. For example, they would say that I eat, for example, I peanut eat. So they would say that I want to eat the peanut, or I alone fish, something like that. I will fish alone. Okay, so the point here is that regardless of how the syntax of these set of words were definitely incorrect in our modern understanding, the point is they were able to utilize and to combine these words in order for them to be able to generate new and complex meanings out of the limited vocabulary that they had. And the third level okay, would be the creation of what we call a proto-language. Now, I will give you a few seconds. In your own perspective, what do you think is a proto-language? How would you define a proto-language? I'll give you a few seconds for that, and then we'll proceed with the discussion. All right. So basically, a proto-language is a hypothetical reconstructed ancestor where all language forms are derived. Meaning to say, ito yung oldest relative or oldest relative or oldest part of language or oldest form of language that we have. Now, take note of these keywords. Number one, a proto-language is hypothetical. Meaning to say that wala pa talagang, well, there are sufficient proofs that a proto-language exists. However, researchers and anthropologists haven't constructed this proto-language yet because, again, there's lack of evidence. Number two, proto-language is also reconstructed. A reconstructed form of language, meaning to say that it's reconstructed from where? From the sounds, going back here, okay? It's reconstructed from the stringing of words and the digitization of signals. So that's the reason why it's called reconstructed. Third concept is that this proto-language is where all language forms are derived. When we say language forms, ito yung mga language groups that we know of, the language groups, and then these language groups stem out into different languages as we know it today. All right. Now, the language forms that are created by a proto-language would mean to say that all languages that have existed or is existing in our world today would have been coming from or would have come from a proto-language. And how many proto-languages are there? Well, definitely there is only one proto-language that researchers think would have had existed. Now, a proto-language is also seen as a prior stage in the evolution of human language. Kaya nga this is the rawest form of language. When rawest as in RAW, the rawest form of language. This is the language that allowed the modern languages to develop. And kumbaga, this is the stage zero of language development. Kaya siya sinasabi na prior stage of evolution of human language. Now, William Jones, a linguist, would said that, William Jones, a linguist, was the first person who recognized the relatedness of language to the Indo-European language family. Actually, William Jones is not primarily a linguist, but he was a government staff, I think, from Europe who was sent to India during the time that he lived. And then when he went to India, he realized that many of the words they use in Europe were a little bit similar to the languages that the Indians were using. However, he realized as well na bakit merong similarities kung geographically magkalayo itong lugar na to, right? So he was the first to realize that there are relationships within the Indo-European languages, and these languages may perhaps have come from different we have come from the same group or the same origin. All right? Now, we will be discovering languages in groups later on. It will be in lesson 2. However, this would be a great introduction to understanding how languages in groups develop. All right. So there are numerous theories on how language began. And these theories continue on piling up or adding up as we proceed, no? So right now, according to Bory, there are 10 distinct theories. However, in the future, we expect to see more because understanding more concepts in language allow us to have sort of, how do you say this, more questions about language in itself. So, habang mas marami tayong na-discover about language, mas marami din tayong questions na na-uncover on how language actually began. All right, the first theory would be the mama theory. Basically, sinasabi lang nito that language began with the easiest syllables attached to the most significant objects, such as, for example, why is it that a baby would attach the words mama or dada to his or her father or mother. Ganun lang siya kasimple. However, syempre, in the beginning of time or during the time of our ancestors, it would be a very different case. I have tried actually searching for the initial words that may have been used by our ancestors in associating certain sounds or syllables to words or sorry to objects, pero wala akong mahanap. So I just decided to use a modern example for the mama theory, right? Example as well would be when children want to eat food, they would usually say mama, 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 mom, something like that, right? Have you heard babies do that, right? It's very similar to the mama theory. Like babies or people would have learned to associate words with objects in this particular way. And then when that happened, everything else developed afterwards. All right. Sorry, excuse me. Meanwhile, the Tata theory states that language actually was derived from gestures, that people began to use gestures first, and then after using gestures, they had this unconscious vocalizations of how they move. Such as, for example, do you notice yourself trying to move your mouth when you're trying to concentrate, such as trying to put a certain, kumbaga, a thread in a needle? Di ba parang unconsciously you may do some certain things like bite your tongue or parang grin or do those facial or mouth movements. Ganon din yung sinasabi ng Tata theory, that your movements precede your language. You have learned to associate certain words with language, certain words with certain movements, and these words may have been unconsciously vocalized. Say, for example, as well, why is it that children would imitate the movements of objects, like if they see a doll smiling, they would, or hearing the sounds of dolls, they would they would also have those imitations na para bang if they see as a doll saying hi, eventually they would learn to have said hi as well. Okay? Or they see their mother waving, they would learn to wave as well, and they would associate certain facial and vocal expressions with that particular behavior or movement. And that's what the Tata theory is saying. Now, could you imagine certain activities that you do, especially when you try to concentrate, wherein you don't realize that you are making some sounds or you are trying to speak something unconsciously, such as, di ba parang kapag nahihirapan kayo in a certain test, parang, ay, mapapaganon kayo bigla and you don't realize that you're saying those things. It's only when you begin to consciously notice how you behave during a test that you're able to do that. So, this is an interesting theory, the Tata theory. However, syempre, as we know, many more evidences are needed in order to conclude that language originated from this. The third one would be Bow Wow theory, wherein supporters of this theory would say that language developed, excuse me, only as an imitation of natural sounds within the environment. It's actually also called echoism or onomatopoeia. Now, echoism, because basically people daw all just imitated the sounds they heard from their environment, such as, for example, moo from a cow or meow from a cat or whatever sound a falling tree makes. Some the early our earliest ancestors would have had to have copied those sounds. Okay, and it actually makes sense, right, for them to copy those sounds. And maybe the copying of those sounds enabled them to develop certain symbolic meanings for these particular sounds, such as, for example, when they say moo, they would know that they are talking other people or other um, members of their group would be able to know that they are talking about a cow or something like that. Okay? The poo-poo theory, meanwhile, is something that is a theory that states that language began as interjections or emotive cries. Now, in this particular theory, we utilize the concept of emotions, that people, with the assumption that our early ancestors, of course, did not have neutral emotions. They would have been angry at some point of time, they would have been frustrated, they would have been happy, they would have been scared. And these emotions would also imply certain sounds or would also lead them to do certain or specific sounds, such as ah for surprise or ow for pain and other things. Of course, right now, again, hinanap ko din talaga to. I really couldn't find certain words or sounds that they could have made potentially. Pero ito lang yung mga examples na pwede nating ibigay at this point. The emotive cries shouldn't be very complex string of words, rather one word emotive cues in order to just express how they feel. So that's the poo-poo theory. Meanwhile, the ding-dong theory is more on sound symbolism. Basically, Muller in 1861 noticed that things that words with that small sharp high things tend to have words with high front vowels in many languages, while big round low things tend to have round back vowels. Seems complicated, right? No, it's actually not. Basically, he's talking about the physical characteristics of things. So kapag daw ang isang bagay ay maliit, sharp, and high, if you notice, they tend to have words with high front vowels. At kapag an object is physically big or round and low, they tend to have round back vowels. Say for example, spear. Spear. 'Di ba? Yung high yung vowel niya up front is sp e. That sound, it's high, right? Spear, spear. And the spear is sharp. Okay? Another example would be itsy or tiny, like using the word tiny, which reflects something small, tiny. You see, it's the front vowels are high as well. But say, for example, when a thing is big or round, such as a moon, a ball, the back part, okay, the back end of the vowels tend to sound rounded, ball, moon, oh, oh, ah, something like that. That's his observation. And because of this observation, Muller mentioned that the symbol, okay, the physical characteristics of a particular object enabled the early people to describe them or to group them in certain ways, in a way that the sound that they have associated with this particular object would be similar if the certain object falls under a certain category, such as small, sharp, high. For example, if the object is a small object, a sharp object, or a high object, then the sounds they will associate with that particular object would be words that have high front vowels, and vice versa for those big, round, and low things. Well, do you agree with this theory? It seems a little bit complicated, right? But there are many supporters of this. Now, it's also one of the, kumbaga, theories that is being fronted in a lot of researches nowadays. However, of course, again, many other studies would need to be conducted in order to understand this theory further. Next would be the Yo-He-Ho theory. And this theory would state that language was derived from rhythmic chants, perhaps from manual labor. Do you realize that during manual labor, some people would tend to sing or would tend to communicate with others in a special manner, such as yung heave-ho, or kung familiar kayo sa kanta ng Seven Dwarfs, yung hi-ho. Parang hi ho, off to work we go, something like that. You could search that on YouTube. It's a similar theory to the Yo-He-Ho theory. And Yo-He-Ho is a word which descended from the Yo-He-Ho cry as well, I think from Americans, I think, when they're working. So, according to this particular theory, language began as a form of rhythmic chants that certain groups of people in the past use language to cry out for help or to seek for assistance or cooperation from others, such as grouping together. Okay, it's a sign that when you hear this particular sound, it means that we have to work or we need to cooperate. Something like that. Of course, in the ancient times, hindi naman natin pwedeng sabihin na heave-ho yung piniling gamitin ng mga ancestors natin or hi-ho. They would have made a less complex language form or a less complex sound, but these sounds would have been very, excuse me, distinguishable. Okay, that workers were able to understand. Meanwhile, the sing-song theory would state that language comes from laughter, courtship, cooing, play. Again, this anchors on the notion that people back then would already have had certain emotions, and there are certain distinct ways by which they would have expressed their emotions to other people. So, Jesperson would say that language is something that stemmed from laughter or courtship or cooing that people shared together. And actually, the first human words were long and musical. And this is anchored on a belief that language did not develop through a set of words, but rather they heard certain music that is existing within the environment that they try to copy and integrate into their lives. And this music may come from the normal activities of the environment, such as fireflies in the night, or even laughter from other people, or courtship, or cooing, or playing, right? And this is actually supported by Vanny Schutt in 2014 when he said that music is the innate quality that allowed people back then to develop language. There is music existing back then. Say, for example, when birds sing to call on their flock, right? Or even when babies react positively to music or sound. Why is it now that babies would sometimes, or would most of the time actually, smile kapag nakakarinig sila ng music, or even when kapag kinakantahan sila? bakit daw ganon yung reaction ng babies? There would have to be an evolutionary reason for that. And according to them, to this particular theory, it's because the music is the innate thing that allowed language to develop, and it's actually not the other way around. Okay? But of course, we have to make the distinction that the music they are referring to back then is not the type of music that we know today, that the complex songs, yung merong mga humming and all. Maybe it's coming from music normally occurring from the environment, or music that has to do with, again, laughter, courtship, cooing, or play. All right? Now, the Heiau theory would state that language is an interpersonal expression of identity and belongingness. At one point in time, our ancestors would have had the need to express themselves in a certain way, such as in the form of ownership. Say, for instance, when people were able to settle into a particular place, or were able to hunt or to gather things or food for their survival, they would have had to develop a system of how to distinguish what is theirs and what is not theirs. And this particular activity would have entailed the development of language. The reason why it's called contact theory, because it's interpersonal. Ibig sabihin, language did not occur as a product of just speaking to oneself, but learning to speak to other people. Say, for example, help, hey, I, you. These words are something that could be related to the Heiau theory in a modern sense, and people during the ancient times, or the earlier, from hundreds of thousands of years ago, would have had to utilize the same level of ownership and interpersonal interaction in order to allow a certain communicative relationship to occur. Okay? The hocus pocus theory, it's somehow a funny name, right? But yeah, the hocus pocus theory naman looks at language as something that emerged from religious and spiritual symbols. Remember, during that time, syempre wala naman talagang organized belief system or religion. However, the early people, the early human species would have had to develop a certain likeness for worshiping spiritual beings. And they may have had associated magical sounds to certain animals or inanimate objects for the purpose of religious praise, such as, for instance, hunting successfully and being able to express thanks for those hunting activities, or parang making themselves be safe from danger. And these magical sounds, they didn't actually they put certain meaning into these sounds, but the meanings they have put is religious or spiritual, such that it could be associated with our common prayers, like praying Hail Mary, or praying Our Father, or praying any other form of prayer, or worshiping, would be somehow an expression of language as well, right? But in the case of our early human ancestors, this would be less complex, but it's still symbolic. All right. And the last theory would be the Eureka theory. This particular theory would state that language was consciously invented. If you would notice, in the previous discussions of the 9 theories of language development, or the 9 theories of the origins of language, people or theorists would say that kumbaga parang they are supporting that language was unconsciously developed. However, in the Eureka theory, sinasabi lang dito na language was actually consciously invented. So people really tried to want to have a set of language that allowed them to communicate better. Now, if you would think about it, it would actually make sense, right? However, the question and the criticism for this particular theory would be, would human beings back then be actually would they be actually capable of doing this or consciously having the capacity to do this? That's one particular question. Now, if you would notice, there are certain theories that we have discussed that would maybe a little bit more possible than the others. However, the good thing to know about this particular theories that we have discussed is that these theories anchor on certain social and intrapersonal activities that may have had occurred back then. So kung mapapansin nyo, these theories are all related to environmental conditions, which is a very feasible basis of language development. However, the question would still remain, how and when did language originate? Okay, and where did language originate? What developments led to it? Right now, these questions continue to be left unanswered. However, these particular lesson that we have discussed today continue to provide us an avenue for expressing or hypothesizing on what may have happened, on what developments may have led to this particular modern language that we are using now today. So this ends our lesson uh, for this particular topic. Now, on the next lesson, we will proceed to understanding language groups or language families and how these particular language groups are adapted into an individual's language capacity. So stay tuned for the next video, which will include that. And then the third video for Unit 1 would be on the research methods for studying language. So thank you for listening, and I hope you learned a lot today.